Right, good evening, everybody. We don't quite have the full house of people who've registered who've joined us, but it is 7:01, so I'm going to kickstart. The thumbs up, David, if you can hear me.
I can hear you loud and clear. Hi, Yolan.
Great. So good evening to everybody else. It's Yolan Friedmann here. I'm the Chief Executive of the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all back to another one of our wild chats. Probably almost one of the last ones for this year. So I can't believe that this year is racing to an end. I heard it well described the other day by a colleague of mine who described this year as January, February, March, COVID, December. So that pretty much is how I think all of us feel. And here we are almost in December. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all this evening. And we're sort of, I suppose you could say, co-hosting this webinar with our friends at Jacana Publishing, who have done such extraordinary work over decades to produce fantastic pieces of literature, entertainment, and education in the space of producing books like the one we're going to be chatting about this evening. So our author, colleague, and friend who is here this evening with us is David Bristow, and he's going to be chatting to us about another one of his books. David, I've heard you use the number broadly that you've published about 20 books. I don't know if this is 20 or this is 21. You can tell us shortly. But the book is entitled Big Pharma, Dirty Lies, Busy Bees, and Eco-Activists. And it's full of stories about eco-activism in South Africa. David calls it environmental stories, but I think a lot of them are not necessarily environmental stories as much as some of them are environmental tragedies. But I think David's going to be talking us through that this evening. Just in terms of introducing David, David talks about himself as an environmentalist, but perhaps, David, I'm going to introduce you and pose the very first question to you, if that's okay. You've got a long and esteemed history in journalism and book production. You call yourself a storyteller, and I've learned a little bit about your passion for storytelling and how all of that started. But that's not where you necessarily saw yourself starting out in life. I believe you once wanted to be an architect. And somewhere along the lines, you landed up at Rhodes studying journalism. And thereafter, apparently, the story ends up with you in the Himalayas, and a passion for rock climbing, the environment, and storytelling came together with your background in journalism, and off you went. So perhaps you can answer the very first question and continue to introduce yourself, is perhaps give us a little bit of background as to that journey of storytelling and environmental journalism, and your passion for telling stories that is either 20 or 21 books over a lifetime, and why you do this. What do you see yourself in terms of trying to communicate to people, which has clearly become a lifelong passion of yours?
Okay, that's quite a long question, so maybe the answer will also have to be quite long. Yeah, my childhood fantasy was to be an architect, but there's a crucial date in my life. It's June the 16th, 1976. I was working as an assistant town planner before starting architecture when the schools started burning. And it dawned on me on that day, somehow, like a bolt of lightning, that I wanted to be a journalist or a writer, but there was no job description to be a writer. There didn't seem to be. So I went and studied journalism. And I fell in, I like to say, I fell in with a bad crowd, as you say, rock climbers and mountaineers. And so many of them were so well, so knowledgeable about the environment, things environmental. And I grew up in Johannesburg suburbia and didn't really know that much. Well, it's not entirely true. There was a bit of felt, but not much. But suddenly I was spending time, weekends and months away with geologists and botanists and ecologists and students and academics who mainly made up the mountaineering clubs in South Africa. And so this is during and post studying journalism. I was gripped by their knowledge of the world. And I knew then again that this is what I wanted to know more about. So the first book I did was a mountaineering book, as a consequence of that Himalayan trip you mentioned, but it was called Mountains of Southern Africa. And it did extraordinarily well commercially. So I took my money and I went to study environmental sciences. I did a master's degree in Cape Town. And that set my my path in the area that interested me. The storytelling is a bit of a darker story. My mother, bless her departed soul, was, to put it kindly, had a troubled psyche. So we never knew whether the evil or the good mother would come home. And I learned to play act, to avoid any physical repercussions. My older brothers got the brunt of the physical beatings, but I literally started telling stories and doing song and dances to entertain my family from the age of, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, whatever it was. And so I acted through high school. That came to me naturally. And then at university, I did a speech and drama as well. And in fact, I did a speech and drama honors degree, as well as a journalism honors degree. So the storytelling has been intricate, intrinsic to my life all the time. Then studying environmental stuff with the qualification in journalism, turned to writing. It seemed to be serendipitous. It all just fell together. It really landed up. I've never made a plan. I've never thought, well, what career do I want? What do I want to be when I'm big? It just happened along the way as I was having fun, adventuring, traveling, and collecting stories all along the way. 14 years at Getaway Magazine gave me an incredible experience of traveling in Africa and further afield, Alaska, the Antarctic, the Maldives, etc. So I've collected stories about all these places, but South Africa is and always has been my only true love. So the writing that I do now is only about South Africa. Does that help?
It absolutely does help. I like the fact that you didn't have a plan, and yet in retrospect, it looks like there was a plan for you all along. So David,
sorry.
I'm very
motivated. When I write, I get up early in the morning. I exercise. I ride my mountain bike or surf if the surf's good. I live in Cape Town, and then I'm at my desk while the sun is still low on the horizon, and I work a full 8, 10, 12-hour day every day. And so the discipline, in fact, it's more like 30 books that I've produced in my life to date. But I'm a bit of a machine when it comes to writing. Not that it dulls my creativity, but the machine means that maybe treadmill, once you get on it, you just cannot get off once you start writing. It's like a movie starts in your head, and you have to keep up with the movie, otherwise you lose it. So my fingers have to dance on the keyboard while my brain is producing the movie.
So David, on that subject of, you said it's more like 30 books. Is that 30 published? Or is that still the 20 published and the other 10 never got to be published?
No, it's 30 published, but I don't count all of them because quite a few of them were collaborations, such as I did the words for photographers' books. Gerald Cubitt and I produced 3 books together for Strake Publishers back in the late 1980s, early 90s. So I don't count those as my books necessarily, but I have had published about 20 books.
You're quite a prolific wordsmith. So David, why this book? I mean, why this book now, 20, 30 books later, a lifetime of being an environmental activist and storyteller yourself? Give us the background to what the driving passion for getting on the treadmill this time was.
You know, I was chatting with John Matham last night, radio talk host, and I explained to him that for as long as I can remember, I've had 2 things in my life that have confounded me. The one was South African politics. As a young lad, I couldn't understand why black men were called boy and every one of them was called John. And you could just call one to come and push your car, apparently. That's how we did it. And this befuddled me. The other thing that befuddled me was the people's behavior environmentally. Now, I didn't have the knowledge to put that into words that I would now. But I've felt all my adult life that I've woken up one day and I'm a character called Dwayne Hoover. Dwayne Hoover's a character in a Kurt Vonnegut book who reads a story that he believes is directed at him. He's going mad, by the way. So he reads a story by a writer called Kilgore Trout that tells him he's the only alive living human being on the planet. Everybody else is robots that God has put there to play a game on him, to see how he will react. And okay, so I started studying environmental stuff in the mid-1980s. And what I started learning then was horrifying. We knew about climate change. We saw the data. We saw the graphs. We knew exactly what was going on, but nobody would listen. You know, it's called the Cassandra's curse. when you tell somebody something. Cassandra was the daughter of the king of Troy, who told them, don't bring in the wooden horse. Well, they threw her to the Greeks, who raped her and killed her because she saw, but the people wouldn't listen. So I'm here, I'm Dwayne Hoover on planet Earth. I'm the only human being, and I'm watching people damaging things at every level, and I can't understand it. And maybe I'm going mad. I feel like I'm that human being who's going mad, because how can people do this? There's a YouTube video clip of trucks, garbage trucks in India, and you can Google it. Just say India garbage trucks river. That's all you need to put in YouTube, and you'll see them, these massive garbage trucks coming to this river, and they just tip everything into the river. And the garbage trucks come and they tip them, and the garbage trucks come and they tip it into the river. And you think, this is a system, this is a human society that thinks that's okay. And we think it's okay to, I don't have to preach to the converted. We all here tonight are the converted, but pollution. What's it, people? What are we doing? And it's all to do with greed on the one hand, and the pursuit of comfort, increasing levels of comfort. Like, I don't want to use a bucket in the shower so I can flush my toilet with a bucket, which I do, because I can't flush drinking water down the toilet. I can't do it. It feels like a crime. And why aren't we being, arrested and thrown in jail for these environmental crimes? So these are things that confound me. How have we come to this point where we're on the edge of total environmental collapse, and we playing the fiddle? So it is, I have no answers to the question, but it's desperate, and we don't have much time.
So David, one of the things in your book that I think is posed a question that I want to ask you is, many of your chapters touch on the decisions made by big business. So whether it's big business driving the pursuit of increased coal production, increased oil production in the face of climate change and carbon data that we have, whether it's big business driving the production of food with additives in it and antibiotics that we probably none of us need, whether it's big business driving, and you give a great overview of the tobacco industry driving the desperate need to increase sales, etc., etc. So we speak about business driving this in the face of greed, but what always fascinates me is behind big business are human beings. How do we reconcile the fact that it's not business, it's not this strange entity of Martians that we can blame one day? These are human beings whose children are going to inherit the earth, whose kids are likely learning environmental education at school, who are probably, one hopes, educated enough in themselves because they're in positions of influence to understand the global consequences of the decisions they're making. And yet it hides behind what big business is greed, but actually it's human beings making those decisions. I mean, how do you, as someone who spent your life trying to educate people around this, feel that message should be transmitted in a way that these human beings that are big business change the way they do things?
Yeah, in the book I talk about, you mentioned, I pull a thread through business and the lies. And it starts, my story starting with the tobacco industry and how they invented the business of denial and obfuscation. That goes through to the oil companies, to the food producing companies. They poison us. They knowingly poison us in the pursuit of share price. It's all about the share price. So I'm not anti-capitalist. I've got strong socialistic leanings personally. But the capitalist system, as Churchill said, is a terrible system. It's just the best one we've got. But it never had to go the way it has gone. From, ideally the capitalist system works when the capitalist, the owner of a business, pockets half the profit, but puts the other half back into business development, which means job creation and keeping the fiscal flow going through society. But what has happened now is that with the current financial instruments that we have, hedge funds, etc., the game is to keep the share price growing. So shareholders, the big shareholders, invest all the money back into their own shares to bump up the price of their shares. Now, how much money do you need? I don't know if it was Harry or Ernest Oppenheimer, when asked that question, said, always just a little bit more. So that is the driver of has become the driver of the capitalist system. You look at the United States, the East, yeah, not the middle section, but the vast wealth of many people. How many millionaires are there? How many billionaires are there? There used to be a few. Now there's hundreds and thousands. How much money do you need? I mean, really? I don't know the answer, but when you're a multi-millionaire or a multi-billionaire, yeah, are you that person who is pushing up your share price to make farmers buy into your seed system, your sterile seed system, which is dependent on one of the most noxious products ever produced, Roundup, to grow food for the people? So I say they walk among us. Their children go to school with our children. But how do they do it? Is there no conscience? Does greed override conscience entirely? Is that human nature? I don't know the answer, Yolan, but it would seem to be. That does seem to be the case. We're prepared to self-destruct for the benefit of short-term gain.
I think it also largely speaks to the human condition, which is the dichotomy in all of us. We're a different person when we're parents at home preaching our children to recycle and do the right thing, and then we're a different person in the boardroom. And that's perhaps going to be the death of us. There's the two people inside all of us. There's the black and the white, the yin and the yang, the good and the bad. I think we know better, but what we do is often very much incongruent with the knowledge we have.
Yeah, I don't buy the two people thing entirely. Let's take another analogy. I won't finger any particular country, but imagine which one I'm talking about. Beating the drum at church on Sunday, fire and vengeance of the Holy Lord. And then the religious leaders of this country, almost all of them to the person, are morally bankrupt. Now it's the same person. I say they're always morally bankrupt. There's no good person there's no bad person in the boardroom, good person at home. They're a bad person, and I'm sorry to say this because there are probably some people listening to me who are boardroom directors, but you can't be two people unless you are certifiably schizophrenic and you need to be locked away in a cage in a big high security institution. You can only be good or bad. That's my take on it. And if you're doing bad to the environment, you're a bad person. And that's how I feel about it.
Well, that probably is the right answer to this book, because I think this book does point out that we're all bad people to some degree. None of us is doing the right thing by our planet. So, David, maybe on a slightly lighter note, I was delighted to see that you have the same passionate abhorrence for leaf blowers as I do. And Tammy is listening, one of our staff members. She'll know that at a previous office block where we used to have the EWT's head offices, they used to religiously send this team round on a Monday morning with their leaf blowers, and I would verge on the point of hysteria sitting upstairs in the second office, tearing my hair out. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the leaf blower symbolizes, because it symbolizes so many things that are wrong today.
To me, it's the epitome of the idiocy of the human race. Now, it gets even worse. If you live in Cape Town, as I do, I live on near Prince George's Drive, which runs south, north, north, south, which is the prevailing winds blow from south to north or north to south. And every Friday, the city council sends around a team of grass cutters and leaf blowers. And the southeaster is galing at 50 kilometers an hour. And there's a guy with a leaf blower trying to blow the leaves against the wind. I mean, it's irreconcilable with any intelligent human life on the planet. But it's one of many things. Like, our houses and our lives are becoming increasingly automated and, let's call it, roboticized. And I remember reading recently how I can install an app and a system in my house to close my curtains automatically. Well, why would I want to have my curtains closed automatically? I can just close them or open them myself. Why is that so hard? What is it? We are magpies. We are mammalian magpies. We just like the new, the bright, and the shiny. We can't stop going for that thing that's new and bright and shiny. And maybe that's what is the driver behind innovation, the various industrial revolutions, the inventions of, from the wheel, etc., to extraterrestrial rocket ships. It probably is. I'm not 100% sure, but the bucket and the toilet is an example. Or there's so many things in the house that one can do oneself, but we have gadgets to do them for us. And we are being told to increasingly install these gadgets. Well, I don't want a gadget-filled house. I know Bill Gates was very, okay, he's an early adapter of tech, but as he walked through his house, the lighting would change in each room to reflect the mood he wanted, and music would come up that was pre-recorded to come up. I mean, I think that's freaky. I don't want that stuff. I don't want that automated life. And while I'm on the subject, I've been quite closely allied with the safari industry for most of my working life, and my partner works in the safari industry. And I have a syndrome I call the scatter cushion index. There was a time we went on safari and we slept in a tent that was just a tent, and we heard the lions and the hyenas outside, and we could hear the birds, and we weren't sure what they were, nightjars or thickneys. But now there's hardly such a thing that exists anymore. A safari lodge now is a luxury 5-star hotel with air conditioning and room service. Now, is that what we want? Is that the wilderness we want? Apparently it is, because every safari company is going that way. There are a few exceptions, very few, in places like East Africa and South Africa, but for the most part, it's the scatter cushion rules. I don't know what point I'm making, but it's about the idiocy of the human race, I guess.
So David, I'm guessing that your point is about, with our race to be more comfortable, make life easier for ourselves, have it more automated, etc. That shiny new thing, the magpie effect, I like that. So how do we make being environmentally responsible and living an environmentally and socially just life be the next shiny thing that all the magpies want? Because really that's what we need to do. That's what drives human behavior.
Yeah.
How do we make it cool to conserve?
Well, I'm putting all my money on the young ones, because that's the last bet I've got. I'm doubling up, double or quits. If I lose, I'm going out on a boat and never coming back. But I think the young ones are much more conscientized. And I get my earphone working properly. I think the time is coming where it will be hard for people, let's call them the Trump support base, to deny that the environment is imploding. I think the steps will have to be taken to address these things. And, it's not that hard. David Attenborough made the comment recently, the observation that one small change in behavior would solve most of our problems. And that change in behavior is simply to waste less. Now, waste less has got a whole lot of back connotations, which is use less, buy less. So if we all wasted less, now most of the resources are being used not by the poor people in the world, it's by the rich people. It's by the affluent societies. And I include places like China now that has many hundreds of millions of wealthy middle-class people who also want to be affluent and wasters. Ironically, China has done more than any other country in the world for environmental protection, and that was to limit their population growth. If China hadn't have limited its population growth middle last century, their population might be treble what it is now. Now we'd be looking at the world population sitting now at about 10 million rather than the 7 million, which is already too much, but I digress. So using less, how do you use less? You start in your kitchen. You say, okay, what am I throwing away? Let me just have a look what I'm throwing away. Now, I'm not even talking about plastic. I'm talking about food. There's nothing more satisfying than composting and gardening and growing a little bit of food. And it only has to be a few lettuces and a tomato, but suddenly you start getting much more in touch with yourself and Mother Nature. Using less means using less water. Cape Town and other towns in South Africa have had massive water problems in the past few years, and we learned to do with less. And suddenly we realized water is not an infinite resource. It's a costly, very finite resource, and we will have droughts again, and we will face these problems again. So we learned to use less. I shower only. We haven't bathed in our house. In fact, we took the bath out for years and years. Probably only use 5 liters of water in a shower. All of that gets reused. But the single most wasteful thing in every house is the geyser. The geyser is an electricity chewer. And when you say electricity chewer, you're saying carbon polluter, because to drive that electricity in South Africa, we're using primarily coal. Currently, more than 80%, as closer to 90% of our power is coming from coal or diesel. Now, your geyser is a very large kettle, and it's on 24 hours a day in the roof space, just heat dispersing into the cosmos on a 24-hour basis. It's very easy to have a geyser switched on and off for an hour or 2 hours a day. You can get an electrician to put a timer mechanism on your geyser to automatically turn it on and off. We have reduced our electricity bill from thousands of rands to less than 500 rands a month just by almost eliminating the use of our geyser. We turn it on for 1 hour in the morning and find that that's all we need. So little things like that can have a massive impact. Imagine if 1 million people in the world put timers on their geyser, and that's before we go to solar geysers, which is an obvious next no-brainer. If you install a geyser, even if you're on Eskom power now, you can have a dual system, and the electricity can kick in when you don't have hot water on those occasional days. It costs about 20,000 Rand for a really top range system nowadays. Now, look at your electricity bill. That will have paid itself off within 2 years, tops. And then it's got a 20-year lifespan, and you've got 18 years of virtually free electricity. So there's a whole range of things we can do. But there's even a more important one, Yolan, and it's the food we eat. Now, there's a guy down in Cape Town called Farmer Angus Mcintosh. Very smart guy. He's South Africa's probably leading organic farmer, large-scale organic farmer. He farms beef, chickens, pigs, wine, a couple of other things. And he says, he puts it this way: when you buy, every time you take a food off a shelf, you are either supporting a regenerative or a degenerative farmer. Now, we need to think about this, because it doesn't only mean on a large scale, somebody's got dogs, but buy local. Don't buy Oreo biscuits. I have a scenario in the book. There's a chapter that it was a project my son did at school, showing the carbon cost of an Oreo biscuit. It is the single most carbon heavy food product produced in the world. But we don't think about that when we buy that Oreo biscuit. But why don't you buy one from the local farmer's market or whatever, the local delicatessen made by a local person who's got their own small business, whose business you will help generate. So the choices we must start making with food is buy locally. That is the single most important thing for us as human beings, is to buy. So locally means it has a very low carbon footprint in terms of its transportation. It's probably made by a caring person who put a lot of love and good materials into that, rather than mass-produced ones that are, let's call them Monsanto products. So buying locally should be the next no-brainer. Geyser, use less water, throw away less, buy locally. It all makes sense.
David, I'm glad you touched on the food thing, and I'm going to explore that a little bit more, but I just want to encourage all of our listeners online, please post questions for David in the Q&A. I'm very happy to post them or pose them to David on your behalf. We've had quite a few comments in the chat site, but if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A, we'll get them answered. I also just want to remind everybody that we have a lucky draw for a copy of David's book this evening. We'll be asking you a question towards the end of the talk, so stay online till about 8 o'clock when we should be closing. David's going to pose a question, and we will take the third correct answer to come through on the Q&A site specifically around that question. So while you're busy thinking about your questions you want to pose for David, I want to just bring you back to the subject of food. And when I was reading your book, and I mentioned this to you earlier, I felt that your book is a combination of the writings of Bill Bryant and Phil Lindbury, which I think are two great authors. Bill Bryant for his ability to condense huge amounts of information and data into a small, readable, and easy to understand book. So I think that's the one aspect. Apologies, those are my dogs. This is going to get noisy, so I'm thinking maybe I should ask you another very quick question, or I'm just going to have to shout louder. Let's see how far I get before they deafen me.
Okay.
But Phil Lindbury is a writer who's spoken a lot about Farmageddon and the fact that the human industrially produced meat process is catastrophic for the planet, whether it's through the use of pesticides to produce grain for meat consumption, whether it's the use of water, whether it's the use of antibiotics, which is primarily for livestock animals, as you've spoken about, there's all those aspects to it. So I just wanted to explore a little bit more about your feeling about, and you've touched on organic and buy local, but just also the overconsumption of industrially produced meat and some of the things you've touched on in your book that do point out that what we're putting in our mouth is probably more disastrous than anything else we're doing as a human species.
Yeah, all right. I'll get to the meat part later, because that's an interesting debate or discussion to have. But the stuff we eat, if we shop primarily at supermarkets for our food, the entire supermarket chain system, and here I'm talking about the huge food producers behind the supermarket supply chain, are geared to producing less and less food for more and more money, to sell it to us for more and more money. When you buy yogurts, there are good brands that one needs to find, but if you're not fussy about the brands and you're using the mass brands, and Parmalat, so that's a mass brand. It's just, very little of that is yogurt as we understand it. When you buy mayonnaise, very little of that is mayonnaise as we know it. When you buy tomato sauce in a shop, very little bit. In fact, in some instances, none of it is tomato. In some countries, Heinz has been banned from using the word ketchup because they found no tomatoes in their tomato sauce. We are eating starches and enzymes and laboratory grown alternatives to food, colorants, additives, that even eggs and butter. In virtually all supermarket produced products with butter and eggs, it's not egg. As I say, no egg passed through a hen's cloaca to produce that pie. It's all substitutes for these foods. We're being fed shit, excuse my language. It's absolute crap. And while not all of it is poisonous, I'll tell you what is poisonous. Some great damage was done in the 1970s by two reports one coming out of Harvard and one coming out of New York State University, about obesity and carbohydrates. About fats. It was about carbohydrates versus fats. And the research was quite complicated, but the message that came to the public was that fat is bad for us. Fat makes us fat. Well, it turns out not to be true. Carbohydrates make us fat. Calories make us fat. So the world food producers locked onto that, stripped out the fats, and bolstered their flavors with sugar and salt, two of the worst poisons in the world. So whenever you read on a food, low fat, it's poison. It's almost pure poison. Low fat anything. And almost every mass-produced food has got masses and masses of salts added. And not just the sodium chloride we shake on our table, but nitrites. And nitrites are much worse for you than ordinary sodium chloride. So I think the bottom line is, if you buy any mass-produced food off a supermarket shelf, you are poisoning yourself. It's as simple as that. And the poisoning goes right back to, as you say, using oceans of pesticides to produce monocultural crops across country-sized areas. While you were asking me the question, it reminded me of something that I go on to. Farmer Angus is the local poster boy for healthy food here in the Cape. But the biggest organic farmer in England is Jody Scheckter, the old racing driver from East London, Sideways Scheckter, and his Renault Gordini, if anybody remembers that. Well, he, after a few seasons only in Formula One, he won the World Championship, he retired, and he developed a military training system that he sold to the US Armed Forces, and took that money and bought a farm in Hampshire called Lavenstock. And he's turned it into the United Kingdom's largest, as I say, organic producing farm, which is an illustration that it can be done on vast acreage. You just have to care. So I don't know what to think about farmers. I know that they struggle. I try to grow vegetables, and it's hard enough to grow a few vegetables in my garden without blitzing them with DDT or whatever, deodorant. But you can. It takes a little bit more effort and a little bit more thinking. But once you start thinking about what the cycles of nature are and how they should be used to control the growings of things, it's not that, yeah, it does require thinking as opposed to not thinking, but it can be done. Meat, I said we'd come back to that. So there's a strong argument against eating meat, but there are a lot of meat producers who argue that a healthy balance, farms need animals as much as they need plants. Once you take the animals off the land, they don't get vital nutrients that they need, just as vegans don't get a couple of vital nutrients that they need and have to supplement their diets if they're not eating meat or fish products. So a farm needs animal products, both manure, urine, as well as the massaging effect of those hooves on the soil helps to stimulate the growth of the microorganisms in healthy soil. And healthy soil is the basis of farming. You take the animals out. You know, in feudal times, the peasants were allowed to graze the animals on the lord's land, but they weren't allowed to take the manure. That was for the lord. It was the most valuable thing in the feudal system, was animal manure, and it drove agriculture in the world for thousands of years. Now, when we strip that out, we have denuded agricultural systems. So having meat to eat is good for the farm, but here's the thing: eat a bit less. We, especially in South Africa, are unbelievable meat gluttons. We know this. The shish and yama, the braai. When I'm a part-time guide, specialist tour guide, and most of my overseas guests are horrified at two things: the amount of alcohol we drink and the amount of meat we eat. Now, I'm not going to preach about alcohol. Cheers. But meat, we certainly can eat a little bit less of. So start by reducing the portion size, and then maybe not 7 days a week or 5 days a week, but 4 days a week, and vary it, and start experimenting with your cooking in ways that just use a little bit less meat, 20% less, 30% less, 40% less. And these are all these things we're talking about are the ways that we are going to save planet Earth.
And David, I think also your point was well made about vegetables as opposed to growing your own and looking for organic sources as opposed to getting supermarket. I think the same goes for meat. I mean, you're absolutely right about farmed animals being very valuable for the soil. I think the challenge we have is South Africa is not an entirely feedlotted country yet, but many countries around the world, their entire meat production comes from feedlotted animals. And of course, there you have quite the opposite effect. Instead of being good for the land, a lot of the nitrates and the other the products from those feedlots go straight into the oceans or the rivers. And so I think it's very critical about the source of that meat, and you know, organic meat that's not full of antibiotics and other things. It's really finding that source and being selective. You know, there's a move, as I'm sure you can probably talk more about, towards having a game meat industry in South Africa. Yeah. It's based on wild and free-ranging game. It probably is going to contribute enormously to conservation. If it becomes feedlotted and industrial produced game meat, then we're actually doing ourselves a disservice. So doesn't that really underpin so much of what human beings do? We start with something that's simple, healthy, organic, and good for us, and then we mass produce it. We find shortcuts. We introduce all sorts of other damaging aspects to it that are bad for humans and the planet, and then it all goes wrong. And I think that's kind of where a lot of your book shows us, is that it's not the intention right at the beginning that's wrong, it's how we've ended up twisting the system.
Yeah, and I would put it down to two things: laziness and greed. Greed for greater profit at less expense, and laziness about being an energetic farmer. You know, there are two types of farmers. Lazy farmers produce badly, degeneratively. Energetic farmers produce regeneratively. So are you a lazy farmer or are you an energetic farmer? But we are superbly blessed in South Africa to have vast, not untouched, let's not kid ourselves, but vast swaths of wilderness: Kalahari, Karoo, Fynbos, Savannah. And yes, and as a result of that, we have two fantastic food sources. One is lamb. You know, we've got a fantastic, by virtue, almost by definition, all lamb is organic, free range. So buying lamb is good, but try not to buy supermarket lamb, and I'll tell you why. Try and find a local butcher. Here's the reason. The farmer is currently selling lamb, depending on the cut, for between 30 and 40 rand a kilogram. The supermarket is selling that lamb for between 120 and 150 rand per kilogram. The farmers are dying. They are being strangled by the big chains for profit, so that Mr. A, I won't give him his full name, can buy a new Ferrari. It's as simple as that. Because he needs a new Ferrari, he's okay with the Karoo farmers actually being driven off their lands, which is a real scenario. So is that okay? Is Mr. A a good guy? No, he's a bad guy. He's a very, very, very bad guy. Sorry, Mr. Supermarket Director, you're a very, very bad person. The knock-on effect of what you're doing is killing us all. And I've got no good words for you. I've got no good thoughts or good feelings for you at all. There you go. So buy lamb, but find, as I say, a local butcher. Go for a weekend to the Karoo. Go to a little town. Go to Craddock. Go to New Bethesda. These wonderful places, and buy half a lamb, half a sheep, whatever. You know, we've got a lovely butcher down the road, Edson's, and I buy my Karoo lamb from him. So the other one, as you mentioned, is game. Yeah, we do have the ability to turn hunting. And I'm not a hunter, but I'm neither pro nor anti, because I understand that hunting is a habitat conservator, because land can have many uses. We can plant pine trees, we could concrete it, or we could leave the natural vegetation and have hunters come and take off venison for us to eat. And there's no better, no healthier meat in the world than venison. So yeah, we have a fantastic opportunity there. And people, and you know, the supply comes from the demand. If we start demanding venison, it will be supplied more and more. I know there are friends of mine who will find it abhorrent that I'm promoting hunting, but I do believe it's one of the great opportunities we have in South Africa.
So David, I've got a couple of questions here, and it moves us to the next part of the discussion, which is great. And it's about hope for real change and finding solutions. And I've got a question, both of them touch on the same point, from Mel Tripp and Linda Dens, asking if specifically there are any businesses that you might recommend online, Facebook, websites, etc., that sell these organic options and where people can go to. And then the bigger question is, you know, do you think there is hope for real change? I think you've touched on that already when you mentioned young people and the next generation. But I think perhaps, you know, the question might be more posed at ourselves still, so that we don't wait for the next generation to clean up our mess. I'd like to think that you do have hope, because you're producing a book that's giving us hope, but perhaps you want to expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, I might sound dismal. There's more hope in the book than I might pretend. But
Yes,
I'm going to look at the second question first. Every journey, every move, every change starts with the first steps. Like Mao Zedong's journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And those first steps are being taken. So researching this book was a massive undertaking, I have to tell you. As you say, I did have to distill vast amounts of information from across an incredibly broad spectrum of subjects, from plastic to rhino poaching to tobacco industry to energy to you name it. But the steps have been taken. There are companies starting to do things like produce, and I'm not talking about eco blocks where you stuff bottles with plastic, but eco blocks where plastic waste is repurposed into large building blocks. So that it has started. Making roads from plastic waste has started. It's not perfect, but it has started. Recycling plastic on a fairly large scale has started. We're not doing enough yet, but the starts have been made. Across just about every industry, when there's money to be made, people will do it. There's even money in human feces. Now, we haven't started marketing it yet, but there's a lot of byproducts from human feces, not least of all methane gas, and we can extract proteins from feces that can be sold into industry for production of many beneficial things. So even human shit has value once we start putting our minds to it. And there are places where people are doing these things. Solar energy is a start. Wind energy is a start. All these things are a start. So we have started on the journey to a better world. So for that, I'm grateful. And for the next generation, I'm hopeful. Yeah.
David, do you think that our generation's kind of bottoming out in terms of the extent to which human beings have managed to destroy the planet and destroy things around us? I mean, as you also point out in your book, it's not just our generation or even the one before this. This has actually been going on for 150 years. Yeah. Do you think we might be bottoming out?
I would like to think so. I'm essentially an optimist. Otherwise, I wouldn't write a book like this. I'd commit suicide. But as with South African politics, I'm an optimist. I believe that although there's deep corruptive rot within the ruling party of our government, I think we bottomed out about a year ago, and that we have started the journey to, let's call it, regenerative government. One feels this, one sees the wheels of justice beginning to turn. And once they begin to turn, you can't turn them back. We have a system that grinds ever so slowly, but ever so finely, as has been observed. So, yeah, I think we've bottomed out of the bad times, I do. But at the same time, the destruction of nature will continue at an alarming rate. There are people whose lives predict these things, but, we're looking at a 2030, 2050 timeline before we feel the effect of the turn. We won't feel the effect of the turn for another 20 to 30 years. So we'll be old, very old people by then. Okay, to get back to the first question, it's a simple one, but the answer is very long. And it's very long because the answer depends where you live. Now, you need to start looking in your neighborhood. When I was young, when we were all young, we went with our mother down the street, the main street of the village or the town or the suburb where we lived, and we went to the greengrocer and the butcher and all of the candlestick maker, and we bought stuff fresh, new, virtually organic. Now we need to find those people again. More and more there are artisanal makers of all foodstuffs and products, all household products, from cosmetics to soaps to even gardening products. They exist. Some supermarkets even stock them in limited quantities, but you need to find your farmers markets. You need to find your local baker, your artisanal confectioner, your deli. These are the places you need to be going, and make an outing of it. You go to your farmer's market on a Saturday morning. For me, it's 2 kilometers away. If you live in Durban, drive out to Howick, and there's markets there. If you live in Knysna, go to Sedgefield Farmer's Market. Have breakfast there, have lunch, do something on the beach. Make a day of it, buy some wine, have a picnic. And then you start. So it's a bit like composting and gardening. You don't become the world's best gardener overnight, but you take the first step. You get in your car or your bicycle if you can, and you go to your nearest healthy food producer and just buy something. And that's the beginning of your journey into a new way of food behavior and food buying. So you can Google. Google's a wonderful tool, but it's all around you. You just have to start looking in different places.
And we've just had a comment posted about the company Faithful to Nature, and they very generously support the EWT on their annual Black Friday campaign, so we get a portion of those proceeds. So yes, I would encourage you all on Black Friday to go to Faithful to Nature and stock up on lots of organic and healthy, yummy delights. David, in terms of writing the book, what would you say what sort of stands out for you as your favorite chapter? And by favorite, I don't always mean, you know, the happiest one perhaps, but the one that's the most meaningful, or the one that you would tell people to read the most, or twice if you could, if one stands out for you like that. One story rather than a chapter.
Wow. All right, it's let's make this about me then, shall we? It's the chapter of going off the grid. Now, I've been thinking about this for many, many years. In fact, I've been thinking about it for most of my adult life. I've never really wanted to be part of the rat race, and I never have been part of the mainstream rat race. I've been a writer, for goodness sake. That's not a real job. But it's given me maybe a bit of a freedom, a psychological freedom to dream about a better world, a better place. And I live in Cape Town, and I'm pretty happy here. I live on a marina. I look across to Table Mountain. The beach is 3 kilometers away. Tokai Forest mountain biking is 7 kilometers away. So I'm in a pretty happy place, but I've been dreaming for the last several years about going off the grid completely. Finding a place away from all municipal rates, all bank mortgages, all bank loans, all credit, and building a home from waste. And when I say building, I don't mean a shack, although it might be called a shack. Remember, I'm a closet architect. Building something really beautiful out of repurposed materials. That there will be no electrical grid. There will be no municipal water. There will be no reliance on any other human being for anything else I need. And it might be a dream, but it's a very real dream. And I'm starting to take the first steps towards not achieving it, but to going on a road trip with my partner in January to look at several places that I've earmarked. And starting in the Garden Route, but more closer to Storms River, and going all the way to virtually the Kai River. And I've got a few places in mind that I want to look at and say, is this the place that is going to make me really happy? I don't know, but so that's the chapter I like the most. And I like it because it's a beautiful dream for me, and I think about it every day, but it could become a beautiful dream for every reader of the book. And I've got quite a blueprint for how to do it. And I use the example of other people who have done exactly this. And, you know, one of the anecdotes in that chapter is a Kingsley Holgate story about take a handful of stones, and one for every decade, will take 7 stones, the useful decades of your life, and throw away as many decades as you've lived. And how many stones have you got left? Well, I've got 1.5. And what am I going to do with those stones? Am I going to stay in an office for another 10 or 15 years and pull a check and commute in my car for an hour or 2 hours every day? Is that what I want to do with the rest of my life on this planet? No, I don't. So I'm hoping I will motivate people to seek a freer, lighter life for the rest of their lives.
And that brings me also to one of the chapter headings that I like the most in your book, because it's very closely aligned with the saying that is attributed to Mark Twain, but who knows where these things actually come from. But it has a lot of meaning to me, and that is that there are 2 most important days of your life, and the one is the day you're born, and the next is the day you find out why. And that's very closely aligned to the title of one of your chapters, and I think that that's something we should all aspire to figure out, and chances are we probably only figure that out when we are about 1.5 stones away from the end. So mindful of quite a few questions that have come through, David, okay, and then also we need to do our lucky draw. Right. So let's see if we can go through these quite quickly. There's a few tips here for you. David Perry Davies, it's lovely to have you online. David is suggesting you look at Zuurbrak. Maybe you can take that discussion offline with him if you don't know about that.
Tell David back from me. I'm thinking of Bryanston, David.
Excellent.
It's a joke and he'll get it.
I'm sure, absolutely. All right. Alistair Stalk is saying, are you aware there's already a regenerative and rehabilitative movement to the local farming industry? A great book is Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. That's just a comment. There's a question from Linda Dent.
Yes, I'm very aware of these things, but I couldn't cover every single
Yes.
thing in the book. There's just too much. But
Exactly.
there are fantastic regenerative farming initiatives
Yes.
In terms of sheep, pastoral sheep farming, land, even mealie farming. There are a bunch of mealie farmers in the Free State who are doing this.
That's right. And I think there's a film that's just been released, Kiss the Soil or Kiss the Earth or something. So it's quite an explosive movement. And that film is not just around the value of regenerative soil for the sake of improved soil quality, but it also presents it as the answer to carbon sequestration and climate change going forward. So it's definitely a big movement. Linda Dent is asking how South Africa compares with other countries in terms of these initiatives. I think that goes back to organic, buying local, and reducing your footprint. Do you know how we compare?
Not very well, but not very badly. But now I just read today that the government is going to have a big push to increase sugar agriculture. Now, it's good for sugar farmers, emergent farmers, but it's a very, 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 very worst thing we could be farming after palm oil. We don't need more sugar. It's the last thing in the world we need more of. But I digress.
A little bit. We're about a minute away from asking your question for the lucky draw, but Marlies May, you've touched on a point that's very close to home for me. It's one of my personal passions in life, and that is the elephant in the room around human population explosion. David, you've touched on this with China and talking about how many people potentially could be on the planet. I don't know if you want to expand a little bit more on that. It's such a sensitive and politically difficult question to ever answer simply, but I just want to say one thing, and I think that COVID's been interesting because what do lockdowns around the world tell us? Actually, lockdowns tell us that if there was few enough of us all to naturally be 2 meters away from each other, there were few enough of us all to naturally not be overcrowding all the time and not need to be in each other's faces and transmit diseases at the rate in which we are. And if there were few enough that, all of us could be economically active while still, either working at home or living in a low density human type environment, we would naturally be containing all of these things. So for me, it's quite an interesting one, but perhaps you want to expand on that in the last minute.
The opposite is happening. And in some ways, it's a good thing. It's a good thing for the environment, but it's a bad thing for the individuals. Although our population has already gone beyond what it should be, a sustainable population, increasingly the human species will congregate in cities, in megalopolises, which will free up more and more land for whatever. So it's good for the land, and humans will show that they can live without nature. They already do. If you look at the massive cities of the world in China, South America, Asia, and North America, massive high-rise buildings. People probably there are people living who will never touch a blade of grass in their life. But I guess they'll be kind of happy-ish in a way. So the whole human race could live without nature. But let we who love nature hope that the majority go and live in cities, and it'll leave the natural environment for we who want it more. But it's a bad case scenario in any way.
Yeah, there's never a simple yes or no.
If that was Marlies Mayer, say hello, Marlies, and I think Bryanston as well for you.
Absolutely. Right. So David, I think it's time to ask your question. And Tammy, I'm going to ask you to just control this. Do you want the answers in the Q&A or on the chat site? So we can just be, I think possibly in the chat site will be easier for us to note. So just before you answer, if I can just remind everyone, please put your answers in the chat site rather than the Q&A. It's easier for us to control them there. And we're going to take the closest answer that comes into the figure that David believes is accurate. So we're not going to necessarily take first or third. The first one that comes in that is closest to what David has in mind is the answer. David, you can see the chat site yourself. Hey?
Yeah.
So you can decide as soon as you see the right answer coming. So what is your question for a free copy of David's book this evening?
Right. What do you think is the total population of rhinoceroses in the world at this moment? I've looked it up this afternoon, and I've got a pretty close, best estimate figure in my mind. And the person who comes closest to that figure, the third person, should be the one.
So I just want to remind everyone, David's question was the world, not South Africa.
Yeah.
So
And
perhaps,
if they can, and it's not that hard to communicate directly with me, go to my website, davidbristow.co.za, and give me your postal address, and I'll post you a signed copy.
great. So David, are you seeing the answers coming through?
No, I'm not. Hold on a second.
Okay.
I'm not seeing
Because
that.
it's up to you to decide. And I know you said third, but it might get tricky because they're coming in quite fast. I've seen one that I think is closest for you.
I can't see I can't see these questions.
The chat, it's in the chat?
But no.
You can't see the chat.
No, I can't.
Okay. Then at my discretion, I think we should go for the first clue. Have you got it? So
I do.
We've got one that's close, but I know you wanted the third. We've got one that's very close to your number.
No, okay, I'll go for the first closest one, but I'm not seeing one that's very close. Okay, there it is. Okay,
there
it's
it is.
Alistair Stalker.
Yep. There it is.
Alistair Stalker. The figure was 20,000 that we had. So well done, Alistair. If you can get my email address, use the internet, be clever, ask EWT or ask Jacana Media, or just go to my own website and communicate with me, and I'll make sure you get your copy.
Yeah, right, so David, with Tammy, yes.
I know Alistair, he's a great supporter of our work, so I'll make sure that he gets your book.
Okay.
Great, and I mean that's quite alarming. There was a time when we would proudly say that was the number of just one species of rhino. Now we're talking about all the species around the globe, so that is alarming. David, we are out of time at this point, but I just want to know if there's anything else that you haven't said or that you'd like to say.
I do, you know, yes. I don't do this often enough. You know, we are told before we die, we should tell the people we love that we love them. Well, I haven't done this enough or publicly, but you know, the publisher Jacana Media have been the most wonderful people, taking my first book, Running Wild, several years ago and running with it. And the trouble they took to make sure that this book, which was a very, very difficult book in terms of, I diss everybody. I name and shame people from the highest office to large business to people like Monsanto and oil companies. And they were very nervous with this book. It was potentially, you know, going to bankrupt them if anybody took option, but they managed to massage it through to a point where it was both very controversial, but at the same time palatable. And so I appreciate that, and I probably don't get the chance otherwise to tell them that. Thank you. Goodbye.
And likewise, David, I think we all owe you a debt of gratitude, because for the thousands of people who buy and read your books, I think that, you know, hopefully they become environmental converts. And like you said, even if they all just do that one small thing, then you're obviously making a significant impact on the future for all of us. And so we owe you a huge debt of gratitude. Thank you also to Carol and the team at Jacana. You continue to support writers like David, who produce not just lovely, easy to read books, but also ones that are meaningful and have the potential to improve the future for all of us. Thank you also to everyone that's on this Wild Chat this evening, and for your ongoing support of the Endangered Wildlife Trust. If I don't speak to you all before the end of the year, can I wish you just a very safe and happy festive season. It's not the last from the Endangered Wildlife Trust, but it might be the last time I speak to many of you this year. So thanks, everyone. And David, thank you again for the book, for your time, and may you continue in your journey.
Thank you very much, Yolan. Cheers. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us.
Bye.